I'm not sure now. It was 1 minute ago. I think it's worked previously, but maybe I'll just get my face. No, it's fine. It's just very delayed. Okay, all's good. It's very delayed. Gosh. That's okay. And it is now 6:29, so I'm going to start in just a minute. I hope everyone's ready, excited. This is some great social history, culture history. It's what the kids these days are calling, in some respects, gender studies. Oh, someone's got an explosive coughing fit. I'm going to mute you all. That's not COVID secure. I feel I'm going to catch something from that. This is what, the stereotype is that in America, you'll go and learn gender studies and then you won't be able to get a job afterwards. And there's a lot of dialogue and people are talking a lot about gender studies. And I'm just going to stop the video for us, assuming that you don't want your face on the YouTube. I don't think it actually will be, I'm not sure, but just in case, I'm going to make sure you aren't broadcast. I don't think you are, but I don't want to risk it. And yeah, there's a lot of political bones made about gender studies, but people don't necessarily know exactly what that means. And we're going to talk about that right now. The time is 6:30. Welcome everyone who made it. I'm seeing 8 people on the YouTube chat and 9 people on the Zoom, which is good viewership numbers. I'm feeling good. I'm feeling happy. So thank you so much all for coming. And let's kick off with my very bold question of, were people gay in the past? Which I think is an interesting one. And we're going to try and answer it well now. Well, not now. I'm going to give you a lot of context and background for what was going on with sex and gender and sexuality in the medieval and main focus on early modern period. But that's the question we're going to try and answer. And just in terms of what we're going to talk about today, I have a lovely image for you here. And this person is, let me just get my notes up. I realize I haven't done that. Gosh, what an oversight. This person is Magdalena Ventura of Abruzzi. And when I first saw this image, I thought, oh, that's a man. This person has a beard and kind of craggly facial features and wrinkles and that kind of stuff. But when you look at that for more than 5 seconds, you realize, okay, there's a kind of male figure behind them. Could that be a husband? Oh, wait a second. They're breastfeeding a child. And in fact, this was a real person. Portrayed by Giuseppe de Ribera in the 17th century. And it's an example of what they would call at the time a bearded lady and what people still call people for a very long period of time. And this person was called by their society at the time female, which is unusual. And it shows that even in the early modern period, there was a much more nuanced idea of what gender was than you might imagine. And today we're going to talk about what that change was from the medieval to the early modern period and how attitudes towards sex and sexuality and gender changed. And then we're going to talk about what those views actually were and how they perceived sex and sexuality and gender. And then we're going to lastly have a think about how far those ideas have survived to this day and if there's anything that we should think about within the context of the modern era. And when I talk about the early modern period and the modern period, for those of you who don't know, I'm talking around the 16th, 17th centuries is the early modern period. So that's 1500 and something, 1600 and something. And then the modern period is like the 18th, 19th centuries. So that's 1700 and something, 1800 and something. That's just in order to give you a vague sense. If you don't know what that is, it's cool. That's what it is. And let's start with, before we kick off, some definitions. And when I talk about gender here, there's a lot of debate to be had over what the kind of definition of gender is. And I don't want to have that debate now because it's such a complex and in-depth one that I'm worried that that would take up the entire talk. So I've got this working definition of gender, which I quite like, which is the range of characteristics pertaining to and differentiating between masculinity and femininity. These characteristics may include sex-based social structures and gender identity. So in layman's terms, lay people's terms, it's how you perceive yourself and how society perceives you on the range of masculinity to femininity. In terms of defining sex, I'm talking about the physical act of love, but that is crucially not limited to purely the kind that can make babies, if that makes sense. I'm not going to give you specifics, don't worry. I'm going to try and keep it clean and not use any naughty words in this talk as much as possible. But the important point is that there are kinds of sex that aren't the kind that makes babies. And that's true in reality, but that's also true as it was perceived at the time and was legislated against, which we're going to talk about also. And finally, in terms of sexuality, no great definition. The one that I'm using is categories of physical attraction. It's about who you are attracted to. And that's this really constantly changing fluid concept that's also really woolly. But let's just think about it in terms of categories of physical attraction, and that'll help us moving forward. And there's some really not nice language that people used in the time, and I'm not going to use it here where possible, and I'm going to try and keep it PG friendly and not use, as I said, rude words or slurs wherever possible, unless I'm directly quoting a person, because then I think it's important. And I think it is very usually possible. Don't worry, I'm not going to say anything really offensive here, but just, be aware there's some nasty language that people use to describe other people, and I'm going to try and avoid using it where possible. So with all that massive amount of preamble out of the way, let's kick off with the medieval period. And in the medieval period, sex, first off, was very much tied to gender. Sex is a thing that one person does to another, or even more specifically, it's a thing that a man does to another person, usually a woman. And that is, that's the most important point to think about when you think about sex in the medieval period, because that will change, and that idea will somewhat change to the early modern period. In terms of gender, there's this really interesting view that men are hot and women are cold. And that means that men are active and outward looking and have beards because of their virility and their heat. And they're strong because they've got heat, and they're more rational and more superior. That's the way that people think about it. And they're more able to control their sex drives and animal desires, apparently. While women, on the other hand, as perceived in the medieval period, are cold, are more passive, are inward looking, which means that they are confined to the domestic sphere in the medieval era, and they're more nurturing. They're in need of heat, which means they're ruled by lust and passion. Women are lusty rather than chaste in the medieval period, and that will change as well towards the early modern. And this has a really significant impact on women's place in society. They're viewed as less rational, less intelligent, less strong. And there are some exceptions to this. Think Elizabeth I, a very successful Queen of England, who was quoted as having said, I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king and a king of England. She's kind of taking on male physical attributes to show her strength and power, which shows how gendered power is. And also masculinity is really tied to violence and authority. So you fight a lot if you're a man in the medieval period. That will change. And the last thing that was big will change with gender is that women have a variety of female jobs available to them in the medieval period. If you're thinking about, you may remember from previous talks, any of my longtime watchers will remember that I talked about how there are actually quite a few different jobs that women could have in medieval Europe, where they can be, midwives and almost doctors and wise women, and they can give knowledge down to older generations, and they can make things and have parts of jobs in labor and stuff, in domestic labor. And a big change that we're going to talk about is that being taken away and stripped away, in large part due to the witch trials of the 17th century. And finally, sexuality. Sexuality was not seen as a category of a person that you are. There's a really big focus on acts rather than person. So it is the act of having gay sex that is being penalized, prosecuted, criminalized, not being a gay person, which will change again over this period. So we talked a bit about medieval. Let's think about how that kind of thing changed. And let's start with gender in early modern Britain. And this painting that we have is by Barbara Gamage, and it's called Lady Sydney with 2 sons and 4 daughters. And one of them has been cropped out slightly here, sorry. But can you tell who are the sons and who are the daughters in this painting? Because I can't. They're all wearing dresses. And when we start talking about childhood, first off, it's worth mentioning, there's not really a gap between infancy and adulthood. When you're about 7 years old, 7 to 9, the first signs of you're kind of hitting puberty, boom, you're apprenticed or working in a workshop, you're an adult almost immediately. And there's this notion that children, prepubescent children, are this kind of big homogenous group with not really any gender distinction. Medically, your early childhood is kind of unsexed, is the word that they used to describe it at the time, which sounds kind of weird, but in a sense it's true. You're not really reproducing, which is a big part of being masculine or feminine, some people would argue. And it was viewed in the society of the time that there are quite a few, in early modern period, there are cultural traits shared between prepubescent children and women, which is the reason that all these kids in this painting are kind of wearing the same clothes, including the mother of them, Lady Sydney. And that's being weaker than men, being submissive to men, and being obedient to them, and being more sickly, having a worse constitution than men. And this will change. And by the modern period, so by about 1787 is the date given, little boys are wearing pants, they're wearing romper suits, and childhood becomes more gendered. But even so, all this time, I'm going to talk about this more when we're talking about specifically masculinity. Masculinity is a thing that you acquire by growing up. It's not a thing that you have by virtue of being born as a child. It's quite a very different view to what we have now in the late modern, postmodern world. Thinking about adult men and women, we're talking about gender studies. Here we go. Marriage becomes central to a woman's life. The only jobs available to a woman in early modern and modern society, not universally, but the rules are of the society, you are a wife, a mother, or both. And that's basically it. There's moral, religious framework for this. For example, God made Adam, and then God made Eve from Adam's rib. So women are seen as like a part of and subservient to men. And in terms of legal framework, they had quite a similar status to children again. For example, women can't have fixed property in the modern period. So if you are married to a man and he dies, then you inherit all his property. And then you become married to another man, he will get all your stuff by law. So it kind of sucks, basically, being the average woman in this time. And there are exceptions to this, and there is reaction to this. For example, Georgina of Devonshire was a leading Whig politician in 1784. She went out and canvassed and was really engaged in political life. She was mocked for this, but she did things. And Mary Wollstonecraft wrote one of the best books of all time, Vindication of the Rights of Women, who's actually her daughter was Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, fun fact. But, there are people who are making a living by writing. That became a job in the modern period, not so from the early modern period. And that's kind of how women lived. And on the other hand, masculinity, Thomas Fletcher really argues, he's a historian, that masculinity is something that was acquired. For example, you grow a beard, you gain the ability to reproduce and be a man, and you gain, as you get older, wealth and power, and you become in charge of a household. Being in charge of a household is a really important part of being a man in the modern period. And it's not the only kinds of masculinity. For example, Ralph Jackson, who wrote a diary that is really important for our understanding of early modern Britain, he became a justice of the peace. So you can gain political office and show your masculinity by being in charge of an area. Jonas Hanway was a massive philanthropist. So you show your masculinity by donating lots of money to charity. Isaac Newton, he found that being celibate, so not reproducing, was really central to his scientific endeavors. He famously never married, never had sex. In fact, he's quoted as saying that he would calculate prime numbers whenever he had, and I quote, sinful thoughts, which is kind of hilarious. But it's important to note that military valor, violence being tied to masculinity, is on the decline in this period. There used to be a thing called gentry militias, where when you're not in the army, you still take part in forming up a militia to defend your county if you're ever attacked. But that wanes over the 18th century dramatically. For example, in 1745, when the Jacobites invade Scotland, from Scotland down into England, no one stops them until Derby, which is like 2/3 of the way down England. So the idea of fighting reduces a lot. Duels die out over this period completely. Boxing, in terms of sports, another point, boxing used to be this very loose, people just beat each other up for sport? Well, in 1745, it gets a strict set of rules for the first time. Things are being more constrained. Ale houses have always been popular in the early modern period. You drink and get drunk and fight and whatever. But in the modern period, you get coffee houses where you can discuss reason and discourse and politics because we're all nice and ordered and civil. Civility is very important. There's a rise of politeness. There's a fashion for displays of sentimentality and exaggerated emotion by the 1770s. And that is still kind of in some ways directly contradictory with other ideals of masculinity. Doing sports and being in charge of your household and being in charge of your wife. That often involves violence, unfortunately. And that shows that there are these kind of inherent contradictions to their notions of masculinity. There are still inherent contradictions to our notions of masculinity. That's the thing that survived. And finally, a little bit about old age. Firstly, when do we define when old age begins? Around the age of 50s to 60s. It's younger than we are now, but older than it had been before, maybe. It's when you start seeing the physical signs of age. There's definitely talking about getting gray hair, wrinkles. You can't reproduce anymore, for example. And when, by the time you're age 60, for example, if you're a person working the land, if you're a farmer and your local lord wants, all the local people to build a moat or something, when you hit the age 60, you're no longer liable to be compulsory labor. They can't make you work anymore. So that's kind of a sign of being old. And there is a distinction as well between being mature and being decrepit. So there's an idea that there's a good old age to have, and there's also a bad old age. And there's an idea that kind of youth is feminine and old age is masculine. That's the sort of idea. Even age is gendered. What a life we lived and still live. And there's a rise of cosmetic beauty where older women want to keep their youth down, whereas men are growing beards as quickly as possible to gain their age. But it's also worth noting that older women, while being marginalized as outside of patriarchal structures, you can't have kids anymore, so you can't be in that household unit. But what you can do is own property. If you're a widow and you're not going to remarry, then, okay, it's not fixed, but you still have property. There's a stereotype of the merry widow who has some income from working. The etymology of the word spinster as an old lady is someone who spins cloth and so can gain income by doing labor. And you kind of have to be an old lady to be able to do that because you're no longer being a wife or a mother. Your partner is dead or you never marry. And so there's a kind of life, it's outside the norms, it's outside the society, but you can have a good time. If you're making some money, you're getting drunk, you don't have a husband to boss you around all day, it's not necessarily awful. And finally, there is a waning respect for old age. It used to be that people found memory very important. The old person remembers the old stories, the old medicine, the old ways of doing things. But as print and as literacy rise, that becomes less important because you can read in books how to do things. And you don't need to rely on the old person in the village anymore. So old age becomes this modern view of bad people who are just a burden on their society. That didn't used to be the case, but it kind of is now, as the historian Eliza Hayward talks a lot about in very interesting ways. So that's gender in early modern Britain. Let's talk about sex, baby. So we're going to be very delicate here, don't worry. We'll use civil language the whole time. Let's not freak anyone out. How do people know about it? They did not have sex ed in the way that modern schools do. Well, in some senses, there's a lot of lack of privacy that we have now in non-upper class families. In what's still basically a peasant family, you can't afford multiple beds. You have one big bed. And kids would be in the bed while the parents are making more kids, which is kind of completely crazy to modern eyes and ears. That seems really weird. But that's the way they did it. So that's one way of knowing about it. Also, people lived with animals in a way that you really don't for food, for clothes, for companionship. It was really common. And so if you live with animals, then you'll see animals making more animals. That's the way that I guess you would learn about it. And also sex work. One of the main jobs that women could have that wasn't wife, mother, or spinster was prostitute. It was very, very common in this period. And so that's a way to learn about it, kind of thing. And there's also some print literature that exists. And we're going to talk about that more when we're talking about the experiences that people had, because it's important there. But finally, it's worth noting that there's a lot of policing on about sex in this period. What the church wants, and this gets co-opted into the state from the early modern to the modern period, is to limit sex to exclusively the kind that's reproductive and exclusively within marriages. So this is the closest I stray to using naughty words here. Sodomy is a crime, and it is anal or oral sex that takes place. Here are the three kinds: man-man, man-woman, or man-animal. And all three are illegal, and all three have the death penalty. And there is no association in the early modern period with a particular subgroup of people who take part in these kinds of acts. And we're going to talk more about that when we talk about sexuality, but that's worth mentioning. So most kinds of sex are punishable by death. Kind of crazy. And obviously it's very hard to actually prosecute someone for this. And there are some, but there are very few cases where people are actually punished for it. But that's worth pointing out. There's also this notion that it's not as bad as sodomy, but there's fornication, which is just extramarital sex, which is frowned upon societally, but it's not punishable by death in the way that sodomy is. But what's worth noting is that in the early modern period, popular culture is much less concerned with it, and print media really openly talks about sex in a way that would have been illegal. But then by the modern period, it moves from the public sphere to the private sphere, and it becomes state policed rather than the church and the community. And it's a lot more frowned upon. Oops, I've skipped ahead by accident. And finally, let's talk about experiences. Most experiences and personal narratives that we have are skewed towards men. Samuel Pepys, if you've done any history that's early modern and British, you'll have heard of him. He was a political figure who wrote a diary that includes the Great Fire of London and the political upheavals of the 17th century. And he talks about his sex life in code, but he kind of casually mentions it. It's kind of weird. And he talks about how he bought this book called L'Escole des Filles, which is a French pornographic book. So clearly people were open about it in the 17th century, in the early modern period. And we know for a fact that prostitution is very, very common in the way that it was policed. And also a lot of jokes in popular print assumed knowledge of sex. And that's a really good way, when it's not openly talked about it because it's illegal, a good way to know if it's still known about is if the jokes assume that everyone knows it. They have to get it to get the jokes, which means that it has to be happening. Now, narratives that weren't male-focused were often made illegal. There was a book called Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure that was banned. You couldn't buy it. Some people illegally sold it, and so it did seep into the popular consciousness a bit, but it really wasn't talked about. And then finally, we have the lady Aphra Behn. I think it's how you pronounce her name. Might be Ben. It's Behn, who is this. The painting that we have here is of her. And she was one of the first ever women to make a living writing. She wrote poetry and books and plays. And the Bronte sisters and Marianne Evans, who went by the pen name George Eliot, that for some reason she's still known as, and Jane Austen, they all kind of descend from her. She was one of the first people to write. And she wrote poetry about being with men. And then one of the last poems that she wrote, literally while she was on her deathbed, because I think she knew what the societal reaction would be, was called To the Fair Clorinda. And I'm going to read you a very short bit of it because it's pretty amazing. And she says, quote, "And without blushes I the youth peruse, when so much beauteous woman is in view, against thy charms we struggle but in vain, with thy deluding form thou givest us pain." So you can tell that people were writing about it, and sometimes even writing about it in those terms. And while we're talking about that, let's talk about sexuality. First off, it is difficult to look at the history of sexuality because it's illegal. So no one openly really talks about it unless they're like dying and then they publish a poem like Aphra Behn did. And secondly, there's no real language to describe it. Homosexual, the word, comes about in the late 19th century is when it becomes popular. So for most of this period, there's just no word to describe that kind of people. So what did people talk about? Well, first off, there is a view that develops over the modern period of the kind of person that engages in sodomy. And this includes the fop, and the macaroni is a weird. That was the word used to describe them. That's this fine fellow, good-looking lad on the left. Well, I say lad, I'm going to talk about that. That's possibly a vexed question. And the libertine. And there are various words that describe people who are really sexually liberal and will basically sleep with anyone, is the kind of view about them. And they have, in that sense, in some ways, it's regarded as, well, okay, so that's kind of a perception of possibly same-sex relationships, but the kind of person who behaves in an effeminate way, that becomes linked to sodomy over the modern period. At the start of this period is kind of a notion that, yeah, everyone wants to commit sodomy, but you just don't do it because it's a sin. And by the end, it's, oh, there's this effeminate man who has same-sex relationships. And that's a view that's still kind of survived to this day. We still, in popular culture, view gay people as, in some senses, effeminate. And that arises in the 18th century. And in those ways, they have transgressed not sexual distinctions, but gender distinctions. Because there's no view of straight, bisexual, gay, there's only a view of male, female. They have lost their masculinity by behaving in these effeminate, elaborate ways. And you might note that that was strange because and wear these elaborate wigs in the 18th century. And that kind of shows how contradictory society can be, unfortunately. But there is an interesting point. And Randolph Trumbach, he's a historian, he argues very controversially that by the mid-18th century, there's this very clear notion of a sodomite, and that loses the male-female part of it, and it loses the male-animal part of it, and it becomes about male-male sex. And that's when you start hearing about it more. And I'm going to read you a quote from the Oxford Magazine in 1770. And it uses some quite unfortunately dehumanizing language. So kind of brace yourself for that. It kind of sucks the way they talk about people, but I think it's very interesting when describing a macaroni, which is the person depicted here, the kind of effeminate person who engages in male-male sex. And it says this, quote, "There is indeed a kind of animal, neither male nor female, a thing of the neuter gender, lately started up among us. It is called a macaroni. It talks without meaning, it smiles without pleasantry, it eats without appetite, it rides without exercise, it wenches without passion." And that kind of gives us an insight into the world of people living in the early modern era who didn't feel like they conformed to the gender and sexuality norms of their period. And these people dressed in ways that were seen as unusual, though in some ways reflected in wider populist culture. And it seems like were kind of miserable. They talk without meaning and smile without pleasantry and eat without appetite. And that's kind of a shame, but it shows that these kind of people have always existed. And as long as there is language to talk about them, they have behaved in these ways. And that's when we get to what is sexuality? And did these people always behave in these ways? And there are two main spheres, the two main sides to this argument. There's Michel Foucault and John Boswell, the two biggest people arguing on each side, and they're pictured here, these lovely lads. And they were writing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s as in 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And they were both gay men. I believe they both died of AIDS, in fact. And they were writing within this very fraught political sphere where they were essentially arguing for their existence. They lived in a very homophobic period of human existence. And they were writing to try and defend their existence as gay people. And on the one hand, you have Foucault, and I'm conscious of the time, but I really don't want to skip over this because I think it's really important. You have Foucault, he wrote a book called The History of Sexuality, where he argues that the concept of sexuality is an invention of modernity. And there are increasingly scientific understandings leading to categorizations of normal or abnormal. There's this modern obsession with pathologizing types of behavior that's led to people talking about people as straight, bisexual, and gay as these three categories. And that really that distinction doesn't exist and hasn't existed through history. People have engaged in homosexual and bisexual and heterosexual acts throughout history. And it's only now that they're being put into these definitions. And Sexual pleasure has been regulated in the West for generations through discourse about what we can call natural. And there's this modern idea that managing gender and sex is seen as not just good for the individual, but good for society as well. That it benefits society if you behave in these heteronormative, cisnormative ways. That's one side. The other side is John Boswell, and he brings up same-sex unions in pre-modern Europe, so before even the medieval period, before the modern era. People, men and women, were in unions that, if not recognized by the law as marriage, were still lifelong partnerships. And he argues that Christianity has erased memories of same-sex couples that existed in the ancient world, and he talks a lot about Rome and ancient Greece, for examples. And that while different societies have categorized different sexualities in different ways, there are consistencies. And he talks about straight and gay and bisexual people having always existed. And he's kind of, in some ways, committed anachronisms to justify his modern political aims, which are gay people exist, give us political rights, let us exist, which I have a lot of sympathy for, obviously. So when we say who's right, it's a big topic. And my view is it's definitely unclear. And I know people now who would argue, some of them might be watching, hello, my audience, that they feel gay in a way that they really aren't attracted to people of the opposite gender. And that feels really real to them. So when Foucault says, oh no, it's all socially constructed, they're saying, well, no, that can't be right, because how could a heteronormative society socially construct me to feeling really one-sidedly gay? I'm sure the same goes for straight people. I really don't feel any attraction towards the same sex, the same gender. But on the other hand, there aren't really there's no gay gene. There's not very strong evidence for that being a thing. The science is kind of out on that. It's unclear on either way. My take is people have incidents of attraction, and I'm happy for there to be more discussion about this afterwards, because I'm out of time and I've got 2 more slides to go. People have incidents of attraction, and it's very unclear how those can and should be categorized. I've been attracted to fewer than half of the people that I've ever met, but on average, that means I'm asexual, and that clearly isn't true. So it's very unclear, is basically my take. Were people in the past gay or straight or bisexual? Maybe, which is a really weak historian-y way of concluding, but that's the way it is. And on a quick note of what survived today, first off, views on women. Women are still seen as sexually passive. It is the man that asks the woman out on the date, who proposes to the woman, who initiates sex sometimes. That's kind of being shaken and broken down now, but it's still a very long-lasting, surviving instinct, thing that we now think about. That hasn't been the case even since the medieval period. There are still views on non-straight people, so gay men are seen as effeminate. That's kind of survived till this period, although again, that's kind of being challenged and broken down now. And finally, there is a community policing sexuality. There is still a poor public opinion of promiscuous women. And I'm going to use a bad word here. There's a direct pipeline from whore, which is what people call people in the modern, medieval period, early modern period, to slut, to thought. There are all these words that are used to insult women who are sexually promiscuous, which kind of sucks. And finally, there's this view that men and women are radically different to each other, which is portrayed by this, if you excuse my language, fucking book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, which argues that men and women are radically different. And that's kind of survived since the early modern period and the medieval period, even though there's a study by Bobby Carruthers and Harry Race involving 13,000 people that found on most psychological characteristics or tendencies, including the big 5 personality traits, as well as sex-related questions like rating level of desire for casual sex, there was not a taxonomic difference between men and women on the vast majority of personality traits and preferences, which is really interesting. So the modern science is suggesting that that isn't true. There's definitely a view that our society is and should be heavily gendered. There are men's prisons and women's prisons. There are male bathrooms and female bathrooms. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. That notion has survived, and we can talk about this because I think it's interesting. That has survived since the modern period. So, what can we conclude very quickly? First off, early modern notions of sex and gender and sexuality were radically different to ours in some ways. They viewed sexuality very, very differently to how we do now. But there were some developments in this period that have endured to this day and are maybe now being challenged in some ways. But a lot of them are very long-lasting and very robust and rigid. And finally, to answer the question, were people in the past gay? It is, to say the least, very unclear if people in the past experienced sexuality and attraction in the same way that we do now. And only going 3 minutes over, I'm proud of myself. Let's finish with a modern depiction of sexuality that falls outside the heteronormative norms that they had at the time. And I would like to ask if anyone has any questions on that talk. And if you do, then let's try and keep it. I know this is a topic that a lot of people have like quite strong feelings about. So let's try and keep it civil. If you disagree with stuff I've said, or if you agree, either way, let's be chill and kind to each other, and have a good discussion about this. If anyone has any questions at all, you can unmute yourself if you want to ask over the mic, but that will be broadcast to the YouTube chat as well. And if you want to just type it, that's cool. I'm happy to reply on that as well. I have a question here. Why do you think sodomy laws ignored female-female sex? Was it because women were seen as so weak they weren't a threat? It's a very good question. There are kind of two main reasons for this. One is that women were seen as naturally chaste and so not really experiencing desire. And that, again, that changes from the medieval to the early modern period. So there's a notion that there's no sense that women would experience desire because they are these chaste, blushing violets who are just want to be virginal for their entire lives. And the other side is that sex is seen as a thing that a man does to another person. So it's kind of seen as impossible for sex to not include a man somewhere, which is this crazily male-centered view of it, and almost kind of hilarious to think about now. And famously, while man-man sexual relations were made illegal for a long period of time, lesbian relationships weren't banned. And when Queen Victoria was asked why she hasn't made it illegal, she said, it's because I don't believe it exists. So it's partly that it's seen as not what sex is, and partly that it's seen as not possible because women couldn't experience desire. That would be crazy. But yeah, it's very interesting to think about that women kind of got away with it for a very long period of time when men couldn't, because they were kind of forgotten about as a possibility. Are there any other questions at all? Feel free to, if you don't need to feel awkward or be shouted at for asking a question, that's fine. I think people can unmute themselves. I mean, if there aren't any questions, then we can just end it here. But no one, I'm worried that I've scared people off by saying, let's all be civil and don't disagree with me. But no, you can disagree with me if you want, or ask for more information about anything. I have a question. Do you have any thoughts on Elizabeth I? I'm not sure exactly what that means, and I might need more detail on that question. What do you mean by, do you have any thoughts, personal hypothesis on Elizabeth I there? While they make a clarify, was she gay? There's not much to imply that she would have been. She never married, but most historians reckon that the reason why she never married was because it wouldn't have been politically wise. If she had married, then she would have lost power to whichever man was in charge. The same thing of women not having fixed property. If she had married anyone, they would have effectively become King of England, quite possibly. And so it makes more sense that she would stay the Virgin Queen, as she's commonly regarded, and that would let her keep all this political power that it was very rare for women to have. And in fact, there was backlash against it. John Knox, the Scottish reformer, wrote a paper, a pamphlet called "The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women," because women were in charge of England and France and Scotland, I think. and he was outraged by this. So it was made more sense for her to keep a political power. And I don't think there were, certainly nothing that I've heard, that there are any rumors of her being gay. I mean, it wasn't even regarded as really a thing that was possible. So it would surprise me if there were rumors about it. The question, to what extent do you think religion imposed stronger control on the state? It's interesting. It kind of changes over this period. And certainly religious courts, for example, couldn't prosecute you and send you to prison, whereas state courts could. And in fact, the policing of sexual lives, the buck was passed from the church to the political sphere. And so it develops, and possibly religion had more control over the social aspect of things and policing sex lives. I assume it's, when we talk about did religion have a stronger control, I'm going to talk about gender and sex here because that's what this talk's on. In terms of other aspects of life, whole other talk that would have to be. And there are certainly signs of like community sex policing that seem religiously organized. There's this thing called either a chivalry or a chivalry or a chiviari or a skimmington. There's various names for it, where there's this public shaming of people who have violated sexual norms, either by having affairs or committing fornication or sodomy or whatever, where everyone bangs their pot and pan lids together and you publicly humiliate them, and then in the really full violent ones, you like take them outside and beat them and like dunk them like a witch, or you burn them in effigy and that kind of stuff. And that was often church-led. I have another question, which is, what about the Islamic world and their historical views on sexuality at this time? I know very little about the Islamic world and Islamic history in this period to do with sexuality, I'm afraid. From what I know, it's kind of a similar thing where sodomy is a crime and there's not really a view of a gay person, a bisexual person, and a straight person. From the little I know, so sodomy is still punishable by death in a similar sense to medieval Europe. But aside from that, really, I'm sorry, I don't know very much about Middle Eastern history. It's just not what I've studied very much of. So I wish I knew more, but that's the limit of my knowledge. I have a question, which is, who painted the image being shown now? And is the woman in orange being deflowered by the other woman? Oh gosh, I can't remember who painted this image. I should really, I'll get back to you, Kristen. Sorry, I'll find that. Then I'll tell you later. It's quite the painting, isn't it? I'll find that. I can't remember. I found it when I was looking at a different article, and it was a really good picture to use as the questions. Sorry. I have a question, which is, what were the differences in attitudes country by country? So in vague terms, I believe France tended to be more liberal about this, while England was more prescriptive and shut things down more. I know more about the history of sexuality in Britain than I do in other places, but the fact that for example, the flow of information, a lot of the popular print media that was coming into and being used in the popular sphere in England was coming from France. So to just contrast those two countries, there's a lot more liberalism in France. And there's a small thing happening in this time, which I'm going to do a talk on at some point, possibly even next time. That's the French Revolution, when all ideas of France were really heavily, excuse me, what happened there? I blacked out for a second. Were really heavily re-examined and taken a second look at. And a lot of the society of France changed drastically in the late 18th century. And so there's definitely more liberal stuff happening in France, I believe. I'm not sure about that. But I know that it's comparatively quite restrictive and quite coercive in Britain compared to other places. Certainly, there are cases of people being put to death for sodomy in the modern period in Britain. I have a question, which is, what was the attitude towards virginity at the time? Is it very similar to our conception today? How did it apply differently to men and women? So in all these cases, there's virginity is seen as a thing that is very important for showing that you are young and innocent. That's true in our society today, perhaps even. And it was seen as, I'm trying to think about this. It was definitely a thing that Once there's a lot of examples of there's stories in popular media about the man promises to marry the woman, and therefore she has sex with him, and then he doesn't actually marry her because he just wanted to have sex, and then she is a ruined woman, and the rest of her life is ruined basically because of this. And there's a lot of stories about it, and it's something that happens quite a lot. And that really shows that it was seen as much more important when applying to women than it did when applying to men. And that's still kind of true. There was a rapper recently who took his daughter to the doctors every few months to check that her virginity was still intact. And there's still a lot of there's definitely a lot more public concern, as there was in the early modern period, about female virginity than was about male virginity. I hope that answers your question a bit there. I have a question. Is there any correlation between class and sexuality? Yes, for sure. So there's the way that sexuality was applied, the way that, there's kind of two sides to it. There's one in terms of the policing of it and one in terms of the actual thing of it. And we know a lot less about working class people in general because they didn't didn't have the access to the education that let them write things down as much as people in the upper classes did. But what we do know is, for example, while in general the upper classes tended to be shielded from the law, it was seen as a sign of aristocratic corruption that they were engaging in sodomy. And a picture like that of the macaroni, which I had here, that's the kind of clothes that only upper class people can afford. So we're really seeing the different way that it's perceived between upper and lower classes in Britain. And there's a notion that the aristocratic classes are a bit more effeminate, and that gets tied more towards sodomy because they can afford to have makeup and wigs and fine clothes and that kind of thing. And that gets tied into this world of sexuality in the modern period. Questions flying from everywhere. What were the penalties for sexual abuse, such as unwanted, non-consensual sex? So, whoops. I've lost the screen by accident. There were strict penalties for it if it could be proved, and that would it was a crime that was prosecuted sometimes, but I say sometimes, and unfortunately it was very infrequently prosecuted, though it was seen as a crime, and again exclusively a thing that a man does to another woman or sometimes to another man. And it was illegal. It was very rarely actually prosecuted, which kind of sucks again. When did the word gay appear to describe homosexuality? Was it used for lack of a dictionary word? Or what was it being outlawed? I don't actually know about that. I don't know the origin of the word gay. That's a question that's so good. I need to look it up and then get back to you later. I think it was primarily, from what I vaguely remember, it's a 20th century word in general, early 20th century. It's around the 1920s when you start seeing the word gay being used. Before then, it's just either homosexual or sodomite or that kind of thing. But that is really, I'm not sure. And that's a type 2. That's a question that's so good. I need to get back to you afterwards. So sorry about that, but that's a good question. I'm gonna find it afterwards. And I think it's more in the late modern period, which is a bit after the scope of this, that we start seeing the word gay. And it's more in that it's later, basically, is my sneaky way of avoiding answering that question, is saying not in the scope of the talk. But really, I don't know. And I think it comes around the 20th century. Are there any other questions at all? There's a sudden rush of them, which is pretty good. Thank you very much, everyone. These were very good. I was worried that there wouldn't be any, but there's suddenly a bunch of very, very good questions. It is now more than 1:15, which means we've had more talking than we do normally. And I'd like to thank you all very much for coming. It's great, as always. I always say this. It's so wonderful to see so many people come time after time. And I hope you've enjoyed this one. I think next time will be on the French Revolution. And if you want to look at these talks more, people on the YouTube will know I'm on YouTube at Mostly Harmless History. And it's possibly easier than trying to find a Zoom link that's buried in your spam folder every time, because email hates me for some reason. But if you still want to use Zoom because it's what you know, that's fine. I'm still going to do these on Zoom until literally no one is watching them, and they're all on YouTube, and then I'll just stop doing it on YouTube. But except for that, thank you very much for coming. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. Good job. Oh, there's someone's on the mic. But I hope everyone's staying safe. It's a pretty rough time around right now. And I just got another really good question that's just come in. Okay, I want to say goodbye, and then still Oasis, whoever that is, I want to answer your question once everyone else has left, because I do think it's really good. But yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and I will see you next time for the French Revolution. I hope you enjoyed it. And still
Thank
Oasis.
You,
thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucas. Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas.
In what do you see as being the biggest barriers to greater acceptance of gay sex and culture in this country in the future? Oh, that's a massive question. I love it. It's huge, and that's another talk to to come. I guess. Oh gosh, the biggest barrier to acceptance of gay sex and culture. A big part of it is representation. I would say. Let me try and think of the big three things, because that's an absolutely huge question. The biggest three things would be representation and culture. So gay characters in popular media and where they exist not being tokenized and being treated like normal characters rather than the gay character. That would be one. The second one would be in terms of legislation. So maybe not so much in this country, but in other countries, specific protection for example, banning gay conversion therapy, which hasn't happened in this country. And hi, Nigel, that's a great question. So banning gay conversion therapy, equal marriage, protection for gay couples to adopt children, and that kind of thing. And then can I think of a third thing, representation and normalization, not just in popular media, but in politics. And in it's kind of a lib thing to say, so sorry for that, but like more openly gay politicians and important people in society, basically. I think it's a matter of my take is that a lot of the reason for people being homophobic in the modern world is that it's so outside of what they normally experience in society. And then when they see it, it's viewed as, oh, it's this abnormal thing. Foucault talks about this all the time. It's the categorization of being abnormal. And so the main way to fix that, I would argue, this is me, soapboxing here, is to normalize gay culture and as you say, sex and culture. It's about normalization. And once that becomes normal, then I think people will stop saying, that'd be my third thing. Not more gay CEOs. I think that's a weak take. More talking about it in schools. And when you have sex ed in your school, you should learn about gay sex as well as about straight sex. And it's about learning that it's a thing that people do that's normal and natural. That would be my third big point. It's about normalization, basically. That would be my answer. So for everyone who's still here, thank you very much, everyone, for sticking around for the secret extra bonus bit of this. I'll see you next week. Next fortnight, for learning about the French Revolution. It's going to go back more into some political stuff, some cultural stuff. We're going to talk a bit about the Roman Empire again. Whoa, that would be crazy, wouldn't it? Thank you, everyone, for coming along, and I'll see you next time.